Hello, Mr. Harrington back. This is my last night in Florida. We figured we'd give you a night shot here. We got our full moon right here. Let's get to the questions. Why did the bird have the prisoners line up in two lines? 2. What did the bird have Louis do after he went to the doctor? 3. How long did Louis end up doing this for? 4. What did the B-29s drop and what did it tell the Japanese people to do? 5. What did the bird tell Louis he was going to do to him after the push-ups? 6. What did the officers decide to do to the bird and how were they going to do it? 7. What was the name of the bomb and where did they drop it? And 8. What did the co-pilot write in his diary after the bomb went off? Okay, chapter 30 we have today, the boiling city. No one in Nahatsu was sleeping. B-29s crossed over every night, and the air raid sirens wailed for hours on end, competing with the roar of the planes. The sound of them and the sight of the endless flocks of planes soaring unopposed over Japan sent the bird even deeper into madness. During the raids, the POWs were ordered to stay in the barracks with the lights out. Once the planes had passed, the bird would bound in, ordering the Americans outside. He and his henchman, Kono, would pace back and forth, shouting and swinging clubs, kendo sticks, or rifles. On some nights, the bird would shove the men into two lines facing one another and order them to slap each other's faces. Sometimes he and Kono would make them stand with their arms over their heads for 2 to 3 hours at a time, or force them into the Afuna crouch, pounding them when they faltered. During one beating, Louis was clubbed on his previously injured ankle, leaving it so painful that he could barely walk. And on at least one of these nights, the bird beat Louis to unconsciousness. Louis's job as pig custodian was over. Barge loading had also been canceled. Allied planes had sunk so many Japanese ships that no one came or went from Nahatsu anymore. Louis was back on half rations. Limping, sick, and hungry, he begged the bird for work so he could get full rations again. The bird brought him a paper-thin gray goat that appeared to be on the brink of death. "Goat die, you die," the bird said. Louis had nothing to secure the goat with and no pen to put him in. His friend Ken Marvin stole a rope from his work site and brought it to him. Louis tied the goat to a pole and began nursing him, giving him water and grain. At night, he tied him inside a grain shack. The goat only got sicker. One morning, the bird ordered Louis to come before him. He said that the goat had gotten loose, broke into a grain bin, and gorged himself. The animal was deathly ill, and it was Louis's fault. Louis knew that his knot had been secure. If the goat had gotten loose, someone had untied him. The goat died. Terrified of retribution, Louis tried to hide from the bird, but his dysentery was becoming very serious. Risking being seen by the bird, he went to the camp doctor to plead for medication. The bird ran him down, demanding to know if he had received permission to approach the doctor. Louis said no. The bird marched Louis away from the doctor's shack, passing Tinker and Wade, who'd been ordered to work outside. Out in the compound, the bird halted. Lying on the ground before them was a thick, heavy wooden beam, some 6 feet long. "Pick it up," the bird said. With some effort, Louis hoisted it up, and the bird ordered him to lift it high and hold it directly over his head. Louis heaved the beam up. The bird called a guard over. "If the prisoner lowers his arms," the bird told him, "hit him with your gun." The bird walked to a nearby shack, climbed on the roof, and settled in to watch. Louis stood in the sun holding up the beam. The bird stretched over the roof like a contented cat, calling to the Japanese who walked by, pointing to Louis and laughing. Louis locked his eyes on the bird's face, radiating hatred. Several minutes passed. Louis stood, eyes on the bird. The beam felt heavier and heavier, the pain more intense. The bird watched Louis, amused by his suffering, mocking him. Wade and Tinker went on with their work, stealing anxious glances at the scene across the compound. Wade had looked at the camp clock when Louis had first lifted the beam. He became more and more conscious of how much time was passing. 5 more minutes passed, then 10. Louis's arms began to waver and go numb. His body shook. The beam tipped. The guard jabbed Louis with his gun, and Louis straightened up. Less and less blood was reaching his head and began to feel confused, his thoughts gauzy, the camp swimming around him. He felt his consciousness slipping, his mind losing adhesion, until all he knew was a single thought. He cannot break me. Across the compound, the bird had stopped laughing. Time ticked on, and Louis remained in the same position, conscious and yet not, the beam over his head, his eyes on the bird's face, enduring long past when his strength should have given out. Something went on inside of me, he said later. I don't know what it was. There was a flurry of motion ahead of him, the bird leaping down from the roof and charging toward him, enraged. Watanabe's fist rammed into Louis's stomach, and Louis folded over in agony. The beam dropped, striking Louis's head. He flopped to the ground. When he woke, he didn't know where he was or what had happened. He saw Wade and some other POWs, along with a few guards, crouched around him. The bird was gone. Louis had no memory of the last several minutes and had no idea how long he'd stood there, but Wade had looked at the clock when Louis had fallen. Louis had held the beam aloft for 37 minutes. On the night of August 1st, sirens sounded and the village shook. In the barracks, the POWs looked out and saw wave after wave of super fortresses. In the skies over Japan that night, America was staging, by far, the biggest air raid by tonnage of World War II. 836 B-29s, bearing more than 6,100 tons of bombs, incendiaries, and mines. The POWs working the factory night shifts ran for the beach shelters, but the planes bypassed Natsu. In Nakagawa, 40 miles away, civilians looked up and thought it was raining. The rain was napalm. With the bombers sweeping overhead, the bird stormed into the barracks and shouted for all Americans to get out. As the men lined up in the compound, the bird and Kono picked up their kendo sticks, walked behind them, and began smashing them over their heads. Men started falling. When Louis went down, the bird crouched over him, clubbing him. Woozy, Louis lay there as the bird and the sirens screamed. At dawn, the sirens went silent. The POWs on the beach came out of the shelters. In the compound, the bird and Kono were still. Louis stumbled to his feet and looked to the northeast. The edge of the world was glowing. Nakagawa was burning down. That same night, B-29 showered leaflets over 35 Japanese cities, warning civilians of coming bombings and urging them to evacuate. The Japanese government ordered civilians to turn the leaflets into authorities, forbade them from sharing the warnings with others, and arrested anyone with leaflets in their possessions. Among the cities listed on the leaflets were Hiroshima and Nagasaki. That night was a turning point for Louis. The next morning, his dysentery was suddenly extremely severe. He was dangerously dehydrated and beginning to have trouble eating. Each day he was thinner, weaker. Every day and night, the B-29s raked over the sky and the bird rampaged through camp. He attacked Ken Marvin, knocked him unconscious, roused him with a bucket of water to his face, told him to take care of his health, then knocked him out again. While Louis hid upstairs on his bunk, sick with fever, he saw the bird and Kono beat 2 sick POWs until they acquiesced to the bird's order to lick excrement from their boots. On another day, Louis looked across the compound to see the bird and Kono standing before a line of POWs, holding a confiscated book on boxing and taking turns punching the prisoners. Louis was walking in the compound when the bird collared him and dragged him to the overflowing benjo pit. After pulling over several men, the bird forced Louis and the others down onto their stomachs on top of the waste pits and ordered them to do push-ups. Louis was just barely able to hold his body clear of the pit. Others were not so fortunate. When the exhausted men failed to push themselves all the way up, the bird pressed the butt of his rifle to their heads and ground their faces into the waste. Then came the day that Louis had been dreading. He was standing outside filling a tub of water when the bird barked at him to come over. When Louis arrived, the bird looked wrathfully at him and gestured toward the water. "Tomorrow, I'm going to drown you." Louis spent a day gripped with fear, looking for the bird, thinking about the tub of water. When the bird found him, he was terrified. "I have changed my mind," the bird said. Then he lunged at Louis and began punching him in the face, alternating right and left fists in a violent ecstasy. As abruptly as he had started, he stopped. Suddenly serene, he let go of Louis. "I will drown you tomorrow," he said. The bird strolled away. His face wore the same loft languor that Louis had seen on the face of the quack after he beat Harris at Afuna. It was an expression of sexual rapture. Louis could take no more. He joined about a dozen officers in a secret meeting. By the time they parted, they had a plan to kill the bird. The plan was simple. The men would leap onto the bird and pull him to the top floor of the barracks, overlooking the drop to the Hoku River. There, they would lash him to a large rock and shove him out the window. When he struck the water below, the rock would carry him under. He would never draw another breath. The officers divvied up the task involving in the killing. A group of men would figure out how to overpower the bird, who was quite fit and would be difficult to subdue. Several of the biggest POWs would find a heavy but portable rock and, out of view of the guards, hoist it up the ladder and roll it to the window. Louis was tasked with stealing enough strong rope to lash the rock to the bird. Louis couldn't find a rope long enough to tie a man to a boulder. He began stealing shorter lengths of rope, secreting them away and tying them together with his strongest Boy Scout knots. Meanwhile, the rock crew found a large boulder big enough to drown the bird and several other men. Somehow they got it into the compound, into the barracks, and up the ladder without discovery. They positioned it by the window. When Louis had finally stolen enough rope, he tied it into one long line. It was looped around the rock, a dangling end lying ready to be wound around the bird's body. Louis then prepared for the second phase of the plan. He had volunteered to be one of the men to capture the bird, drag him up, and throw him to his death. As the conspirators planned, the bird entered the barracks. If the rock was then in place, he either didn't see it or didn't recognize what it was there for. He dug through the men's possessions. Under the tatami mat of an English officer, he found a piece of paper on which were listed the crimes of each of the Japanese officials. When the bird looked up, he saw the men sneering at him. The bird was spooked. He believed that he saw the POW glaring murderously at him. They had never looked him in this way before. He knew that Japan was losing the war and that when the end came, the Americans would try him. These POWs would accuse him of crimes, and the Americans would surely sentence him to death. No one he knew would defend him, and that fact left him angry and panicked. He was going to have to go to extreme measures to save himself. Next to a window near which the bird passed each day, the rock and rope sat ready. From the barracks window, it was a long plunge to the water. At 2:45 in the morning of August 6, 1945, a B-29 skipped off runway Able on Tinian Island. At the yoke was Paul Tibbets, a veteran bomber pilot. The plane headed north toward Japan. The mission was so secret that Tibbets carried cyanide capsules for all the crewmen to be used if they crashed and were captured. As the day's first light walked over the Pacific, the plane rose toward its bombing altitude more than 30,000 feet. Two crewmen climbed into the bomb bay. There sat a 12-foot-long, 9,000-pound bomb called Little Boy. The men dropped to their hands and knees and crawled around the bomb, pulling out test plugs and replacing them with firing plugs. Little Boy was armed. Crossing the inland sea, Tibbets saw a city ahead. A scout plane flying over it radioed back in code. The weather was clear. They wouldn't have to bypass this city and pursue the alternate targets. Tibbets spoke over the interphone. "It's Hiroshima." The plane paused the coastline and crossed over the city. Tibbets turned the plane west, then ordered his crew to don shaded goggles. Below, he saw a T-shaped bridge, the target. Tibbets surrounded control of the plane to the Norden bomb site, and the bombardier lined up on the bridge. At 8:15:17, the bomb slipped from the plane. Tibbets turned the plane as hard as he could and put it into a dive to gain speed. It would take 43 seconds for the bomb to reach its detonation altitude, a little less than 2,000 feet. No one knew for sure if, in that brief time, the bomber could get far enough away to survive what was coming. One of the crewmen counted seconds in his head. When he hit 43, nothing happened. He didn't know that he had been counting too quickly. For an instant, he thought the mission had failed. Exactly as the thought crossed his mind, the sky over the city ripped open in a firestorm of color and sound and felling wind. A white light, 10 times the intensity of the sun, enveloped the plane, and the flash and sound and jolt of it skidded out in all directions. The tail gunner, looking out the back of the plane through his goggles, thought that the light had blinded him. Tibbets' teeth began tingling, his mouth filled with a taste of lead. He would later be told that it was the metal in his fillings resonating with the radioactivity of the bomb. He looked ahead and saw the entire sky swirling in pink and blue. Next to him, the co-pilot scribbled 2 words in his diary: "My God." Behind him, the tail gunner's vision cleared, and he saw an eerie, shimmering warp in the air over the city, ripping toward them at 1,000 feet per section. "Here it comes," he said. The shock wave slammed into the plane, pitching the men into the air and back down again. In confusion, someone yelled, "Flak!" Then a second wave, a consequence of the force of the explosion hitting the ground and then ricocheting upward, smacked them in the plane, and the plane heaved again. At POW Camp 10D on the far side of the mountains by Hiroshima, prisoner Farron Cummings felt a concussion roll down from the hills, and the air warmed strangely. He looked up. A fantastically huge roiling cloud, glowing bluish-gray, swaggered over the city. It was more than 3 miles tall. Below it, Hiroshima was boiling. All right. Pretty horrific there. That's chapter 30. All right, 31 is the Naked Stampede. And we will see you for that one.